Hello everyone, I am Abhishek Verma and in this video I would be explaining the architecture of DBMS. So in this presentation I would be covering the introduction to DBMS and the importance of its architecture, the various types of architecture, and then we would be having a brief about the various types of architecture, and then we would be concluding this presentation with a brief comparison between the three architectures. So let's first start with the introduction. So the a DBMS or the database management system is a software which allows the various users to create, manage and interact with the database efficiently. And the architecture of a DBMS defines how the different components would be interacting with each other, like the users, the application, and the database. So, the architecture directly impacts the performance, security, and scalability of the system, and it allows the users to get their requests for data done while connecting to the database, and it focuses on how the database is designed, built, and maintained, and also shaping how the users access and interact with the database. So now let's have a look at the types of architecture. There are three types of architecture: the one tier architecture, the two tier architecture, and the three tier architecture. The one tier architecture is basically the user is able to directly interact with the database, while the two tier is similar to the client and server model, and the three tier architecture introduces a third layer known as the application layer between these two layers. So now let's have a brief about the one tier architecture. The database is directly available to the user. It means that the use any changes that the user makes can are directly reflected on the database itself. The one tier architecture is generally used for the development of local applications and is preferred by programmers for direct communication with the database, since it results in faster responses. So why is the single tier DBMS used? First, it is used where data alteration is not much, and secondly, the database system is not being accessed by multiple users. And as already discussed by programmers, where we want to use it for development purposes and have a clear and easy method to access and alter the database. Advantages of the one tier architecture is that it is very simple and cost effective, since no hardware cost is required, and it is easy to implement and deploy for a small scale projects. So this is how the one tier architecture looks like. This is the local database which is stored on the device, and this is the application through which the user is directly interacting with the local database. Now, coming to the two tier architecture, the two tier architecture works similarly to the client and server architecture, where the user contacts the database through as the client, and the database is kept on the server, uh, and the direct communication is not present between the user and the database. And for this interaction, APIs like ODBC and JDBC are used. The user interface and application programs runs on the client side, while the database is kept on the server, and the server side is responsible to provide the query processing and transaction management functionalities, and the client must establish a connection with the server to access the database. So now let's have an example of the two-tier architecture. So here we have the example of the inventory management system, where the client is our store manager who uses a desktop application to update the stocks or generate reports and track the various items, while the database layer, which is kept on the server, will store the product details and the supplier information. In this diagram, we can see that on the client side, we have the user and the application. And the application interacts with the server using the APIs like ODBC and JDBC over the network. And on the server, we have our database system where the data is stored. So the advantages of using the two-tier architecture is that it is easy to access, and it is quite scalable comparatively to the one-tier architecture, and it is cost effective compared to the three-tier architecture and the multi-tier architectures. Easy deployment, as it is easier to deploy than the three-tier architecture, and is easily understandable and simple because only two components, the client and the server, interact with each other. The three-tier architecture contains another layer between the client and the server, and that is the application layer. So as you can see in this diagram, the presentation tier and we have the database tier, and we have the application tier in between them, thus preventing direct communication of the presentation tier with the database tier. So the client cannot directly communicate with the server since the application comes in between. This also helps in enhancing the security. So the application on the client end has to interact with an application server which further then communicates with the database system. So the three-tier architecture is one of the most used architecture in case of the large web applications, and the end user has no idea about the existence of the database beyond the application server, and similarly the database has no idea about any other user beyond the application. So now let's have a look at the benefits of the three-tier architecture. That is, it is highly scalable as load balancing is implemented by the application layer, and the database server is unaware of any users outside it, and similarly the client is also unaware of the database outside the application. Data integrity is maintained as checks are made on each client request at the application layer on the client side, thus preventing any data corruption or erroneous requests. And it is highly secure as the user is not aware of this database at the server, and the database is not aware of any end user since the application layer comes in between, preventing a direct link between the client and the server. So, as already discussed, the three-tier architecture is the most popular architecture of DBMS, and it maintains the architecture of the client, application, and then the server. And this three-tier architecture improves the scalability, integrity, and security, though it is more difficult and requires more maintenance compared to the other two tiers which we have discussed so far, but has more benefits. So now let's have a look at a comparison between these three tiers. First, so the first tier architecture is that the database and the user directly interact with each other, while in the two-tier architecture, the application is divided into the client and server. While in the three-tier architecture, the application layer comes in between the client and the server. So in the first tier architecture, that is the working components are the database and user interface, which are kept on the same device. While in the two-tier architecture, there is the client and the database server. And in the three-tier architecture, between this client and the database server, we have the applications. So in terms of security, the first tier architecture is the least secure, while the third tier architecture being the most secure due to the intermediate application layer. And the one tier architecture is not scalable and is generally preferred for small scale applications, while the three tier architecture is highly scalable and is used for large web applications. In terms of performance, one tier architecture is suitable for during the development time, and it is fast for a single user. Two-tier architecture is good for small-scale applications, while the three-tier architectures works best with larger applications. MS Access is an example of the first-tier architecture, and MySQL and PHP are common examples for the two-tier architecture. While the large-scale web applications like Amazon and banking systems are example of the three-tier architecture. So at the end, we could say that the architecture of DBMS plays a very crucial role in how the data is stored, accessed, and managed, since it ensures efficient data management, improved performance, and better security. So, and the factors which are considered while choosing the right architecture for our system are the network dependencies, the security concerns, and the applications need. So in this video, we have covered the three tiers of the architecture, the one tier architecture, two tier architecture, and the three tier architecture, which offers different levels of scalability, security, and performance, each having their own use and purposes. Thank you.